The soil moved. That was the first thing Overseer Kreth Von recorded in the official planetary survey log. Not the atmospheric readings, not the seismic data, not the cascade failure of 3 separate sensor arrays within 40 minutes of orbital insertion. Just the soil moved. 12 centimeters of displacement across a 17-kilometer stretch of what their instruments classified as stable ground. No geological event, no tectonic trigger. Just movement, slow and deliberate, as though the planet had noticed the ship above it and shifted its weight. What made Kreth Von's spine plates tighten was not the movement itself. It was the human boot prints already pressed into the displaced soil. They were weeks old, minimum, maybe months. And they led inward toward the thermal vent clusters where nothing in the Dominion's xenobiological database suggested any sapient species could survive longer than 11 minutes. The humans had not walked out. There were no return tracks. Temperfy 1 pulled the survey file a second time, cross-referencing the bootprint depth against known human mass estimates. The pressure distribution was consistent. One individual, approximately 70 to 90 kilograms, walking at a measured, unhurried pace. Coordinate verification, said his secondary analyst, Prell, without looking up from her console. Her 4 eyes were focused on a separate anomaly she hadn't yet shared. You're certain these weren't placed before the first thermal event? The event reshaped the entire northern basin, Krathbon said. These prints are on top of the reshaping. Prell said nothing. She had the expression his species made when they encountered information that had no safe place to go. He looked back at the tracks. Steady, stride length. No stumble, no acceleration. Whoever had walked here had not been running from anything. They had not been in a hurry. They had walked into the most geologically violent region of Kasavar IV, a planet the Dominion's own survey teams had rated Category Omega 7, meaning abandon, seal, do not return, and they had done it at a casual stroll. 3 mysteries. Krathbon was already cataloging them, because cataloging was the only thing that kept his mind from the less comfortable alternative, which was simply accepting what the data implied. Mystery 1. How had a human reached this planet at all? Kasavar IV was not on any approved navigation charts. The Dominion had deliberately excised it from public star maps after the second survey team. 41 of the most experienced xenogeologists in the outer systems had not returned. Mystery 2. Why had the human walked toward the thermal vents? Mystery 3. The one Prell was still sitting on. The one she would finally share with him 4 hours later as they prepared to break orbit and file their preliminary report, was the one that would change everything about what they thought they were investigating. The thermal vents were not as hot as they should have been. Something had cooled them. Something had been managing them. The file that crossed Krathbon's desk 6 standard weeks later was not from the Dominion Survey Division. It came from Dominion intelligence, flagged at a clearance level he technically did not have, forwarded to him specifically because his survey report had contained 2 words that triggered an automated cascade through 12 separate monitoring systems. The 2 words were human presence. He read the file in his sealed office with the ventilation system running loud enough to cover his breathing. Old habit from his years in the outer territories, where paranoia had a longer life expectancy than comfort. The file was thin, deliberately he suspected, a summary of findings rather than a complete record. But even the summary was enough to make his dorsal fins rise. Kasavar IV had been designated Category Omega 7 following an initial survey in 2.7 Galactic Standard years prior. The designation was applied after the second survey team's losses, not the first. The first team had returned technically. 2 survivors out of 9. One had been nonverbal for the remainder of her life. The other had given a debrief that the Dominion had immediately classified, sealed, and then, apparently, lost. Krethbon noticed the word lost was not in quotation marks, which in official Dominion documentation typically indicated genuine administrative failure. The lack of quotation marks here might have indicated genuine administrative failure. It also might have indicated something else entirely. The second survey team had never returned. Of the 41 sent, no remains were recovered, no vessel signal located, no distress beacon activated. They were listed as casualties of the planetary environment. Then there was a gap in the record. 11 months, no surveying activity. Then one line, unauthorized landing event, origin unknown, duration unconfirmed. Vessel profile does not match any registered Dominion or affiliate configuration. He already knew, before he reached the end of the file, what vessel profile it would match. He read it anyway because there is a particular kind of discipline in refusing to run from the thing you already know. Human, single-occupant configuration, light cargo, no weapon systems detected, no weapons. One person, light cargo. Into Omega-7. What were they carrying? He asked the empty room. The file did not say. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Yara Vasquez, and she was 29 years old, and she had been missing for 8 months before anyone in the Dominion knew to look for her. Krethbon found her name 3 databases deep, buried in a cross-reference between the vessel hull signature his team's orbital sensors had detected and a human exploration registry that the Dominion monitored semi-passively, the way you watch a fire from across a field, present enough to respond if necessary, careful enough not to get close. She was not military, the title was honorary, a designation the Human Survey Corps used for experienced independent operators who had completed a specific tier of planetary certifications. She had 14 of them. She was listed as a specialist in what the human database called Hostile Environment Adaptive Colonization, which Krethbon read 3 times before he was satisfied he understood what it meant. She did not survey hostile environments. She went to them, she found out what was killing things, and then she changed whatever was necessary to make them livable. He cross-referenced her mission history, 6 prior planetary assignments. 3 of them had been rated hazardous by standard metrics. None had been rated anything close to Omega-7. The gap between hazardous and Omega-7 was not a spectrum, it was a cliff edge. Survey teams with full Dominion backing, specialists trained for years, complete environmental gear suites, had died in the first days on Casabre IV. Vasquez had gone alone, in a light cargo vessel, with no weapons. "She's dead," Prell said, from the doorway. Krethbon hadn't heard her come in. He wasn't surprised she'd been tracking the same thread. Prell had been unusually quiet for 6 weeks, which in his experience meant she'd been unusually busy. "The timeline doesn't support survival," she continued. "Even if she managed the initial landing, the thermal event cycle would have—" "The vents are cooler," he said. Prell closed the door behind her. "I know," she said. "I've been running the atmospheric comparisons since we got back. The thermal output from the northern vent cluster is 31% below the last recorded measurement from the second survey team." She paused, "which was taken 11 months ago. That's not natural cooling." "No," she said. "It is not." They looked at each other for a long moment. "One person," he said. "One person," she confirmed, "in 8 months." The question he could not answer, the one that would stay with him through everything that followed, that would reframe every piece of data he thought he'd understood, was not whether Vasquez had survived. It was not whether she'd done what the atmospheric data implied she'd done. It was simpler and more disturbing than either. He asked it out loud because sometimes the only way to hear how strange something is was to put it into the air. Why would she want to? What Krethbon did not know in those first weeks was that Yara Vasquez had not gone to Casabre IV by accident or by recklessness or even by assignment. She had gone because of something she'd read in the classified debrief of the first survey team's survivor, the the one who had returned speaking, before she stopped, a debrief that should have been sealed, that had been sealed, but that had nonetheless found its way to Vasquez through a chain of 6 intermediaries and a human information-sharing network the Dominion had been aware of for years without fully understanding how it functioned. The debrief described what the survivor had seen in her last hours on the surface before evacuation. Not the geological violence, not the deaths of her colleagues. Those were documented elsewhere. What she described was a valley, 2 kilometers wide, surrounded by thermal vent outflows that should have made it uninhabitable. In the center, a flat expanse of stone, cooled to ambient temperature, catching morning light, because Cassavra IV had a morning, had a sun, had a spectrum not entirely unlike Earth's. And if you stood in that valley at the right hour with the vents running quiet, the air smelled like something the survivor could only describe as almost breathable, almost warm, almost like somewhere you could stay. The survivor said it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and then the thermal event cycle resumed, and they ran. Yara Vasquez had read that description at the age of 22, sitting in a shared habitation unit on a station 3 systems from anywhere, and she had never, in the 7 years since, stopped thinking about it. Not because she was reckless, not because she had a death wish, which was the assumption the Dominion psychological profile of her would later make, revealing the first of many catastrophic misunderstandings. She thought about it because she was angry. The most beautiful place in that region of the galaxy, almost livable, almost perfect, hiding behind a thermal cycle that was violent but not chaotic, patterned but not random, and therefore manageable if you understood it well enough and were willing to stay long enough to learn. And it had been sealed and abandoned by every civilization in the Dominion because they had done the arithmetic on acceptable losses and decided the asset wasn't worth the cost. Vasquez had done different arithmetic. She had been on the surface for 19 days before she found the rhythm. Every thermal event on Cassavra V felt, from the outside, like pure geological rage, venting superheated gas, rockfall, seismic shuddering, sulfuric particulates that would strip an unprotected respiratory system in 3 breaths. From the outside, this impression was accurate. From the inside, from the position of someone who had spent those 19 days mapping the timing from within the thermal network, crouched in the dead zones between vents with a heat-resistant recording unit and a water recycler she'd rebuilt twice already. The cycle resolved into something else. It had a heartbeat. Not literally, not with any biological implication, but the intervals were consistent. The pressure differentials followed a pattern that repeated on a 47-minute cycle, and within that cycle there were 11 minutes of relative quiet. Not safe, not calm, but manageable. And if you were positioned correctly, if you knew where the dead zones were, if you had already mapped the 3 secondary vent channels that diverted flow during the quiet window, you could move, you could work, you could very carefully begin to do things. She started with heat diversion. Simple mechanical redirection. She'd brought 300 meters of high-temp conduit coiled in the cargo hold, weight optimized, chosen specifically because it could be deployed by one person. Over the first month, she laid it along the primary outflow channels on the eastern face of the northern basin, diverting approximately 8% of thermal output away from the central valley. 8% doesn't sound like much. It was enough to drop the valley floor temperature by 12 degrees. 12 degrees was enough to make the mornings survivable. She built a shelter from volcanic stone during the quiet windows, recording every construction decision in a voice log that was half engineering documentation and half the kind of thing you say out loud when there is no one else to say it to. Day 31, she said, pressing her shoulder against a stone block she'd been moving for 40 minutes. Eastern wall up to 2 meters. The second conduit is holding. I think... She stopped, repositioned, pushed. I think I miscalculated the thermal gradient around the 3rd vent channel. It's running hotter than projected. She paused, which means I built this wall on the wrong side. She let that sit for a moment. That's fine. I'll build another one. She did. Kreth Vaughn received the secondary intelligence file on day 53 of his investigation, and the world, or his understanding of it, quietly folded in half. The rehook, when it came, did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as a timestamp. He had been reviewing the original Dominion survey records of Cassivar IV's thermal cycle, looking for any indication that the cooling effect Prell had measured could have begun before Vasquez's arrival, looking for any natural mechanism that might explain it, looking, if he was honest with himself, for a way out of what the data was increasingly insisting. The thermal records went back 6 galactic standard years. They were consistent, hostile, and exactly what you would expect from an Omega-7 designation. Except for one reading, buried 11 months ago, taken automatically by a passive monitoring buoy the Dominion had left in low orbit after the second survey team's loss. The buoy registered a localized thermal decrease in the northern basin. Small, within measurement error for that instrument class, easily dismissed. Someone had dismissed it, in fact. There was a notation in the buoy's log from a Dominion analyst: instrument drift, probable sensor degradation, flag for maintenance. The timestamp on that reading was 9 days before Vasquez had landed. Kreth Vaughn read it twice, checked the date conversion, read it again. The cooling had started before she arrived. He pulled his chair closer to the screen. His breathing had changed in a way he didn't consciously register. He went backward through the buoy's passive recordings, further, and found them. 8 more micro readings, all within measurement error, all dismissed, all showing the same localized drift, faint enough to be noise, consistent enough to be something else, beginning 14 months prior to Vasquez's landing. Prell, he said, and was surprised by how controlled his voice sounded. He activated the internal calm. Prell, I need you to look at something. She arrived in 4 minutes. He showed her without preamble. She stood very still. Someone else was there, she said. Before her. 14 months before. The boot prints, he said. My boot prints, the ones I recorded on arrival. He pulled the survey file. What if they weren't Vasquez's? Prell's 4 eyes moved across the data in sequence, the way they did when she was calculating too fast for speech. Then she said, very quietly, the second survey team. He had already arrived there. He had been hoping she wouldn't. The second survey team that the Dominion had listed as lost. All 41. No remains recovered. No signals detected. Casualties of the planetary environment. What if they had not died? What if they had not died? What if they had simply stayed? The transmission came before they could pursue that line far enough to break themselves on it. It came from the surface of Cassivar IV, on a frequency that no Dominion communication protocol used, encoded in a human cipher that the Dominion's intelligence division technically could not crack, but which Kreth Vaughn had, through a set of circumstances he was not prepared to document, a working key for. The message was short. We know you're in orbit. We've been watching the survey signatures for a week. If you want to come down, come down. The valley is safe between 0600 and 09 local. Don't bring weapons. You won't need them, and they'll just erode. Vasquez, P.S. The 41 you're looking for, they're here. They chose to stay. That's not in any file you have. You're welcome. Kreth Vaughn read it 4 times. Each time the postscript landed differently. Not threatening, not triumphant. Stated as a simple fact, the way you'd tell someone where you'd left their keys. She knew we were coming, Prell said. She knew someone would come, he corrected. Eventually. She's been waiting. She's been building, he said, and he heard something in his own voice that he identified only later, in the debrief that he was not entirely honest about, as something he would have called fear in any other context, but which he chose in the moment to call awe because it felt more professionally appropriate. He authorized the descent. The valley was everything the survivor had described, and nothing she could have fully conveyed, because description can carry the weight of what something looks like but struggles with what something means. Kreth Vaughn stood at the edge of the flat stone basin and breathed air that was not quite cool, but was no longer hostile, and watched morning light come in at an angle that caught the condensation on the conduit network, hundreds of meters of it now. A system of silver lines crossing the valley walls like something between engineering and art, and turn it briefly golden. It was beautiful in a way that made him uneasy, because things this beautiful on Omega-7 worlds were supposed to be impossible. Vasquez was shorter than his mental model of her. This surprised him, which surprised him further because he hadn't realized he built one. She was standing by a rough stone structure that he gradually understood was a working research station. Not temporary, not improvised in the desperate sense, but grown, layer by layer, adapted, reinforced, expanded. She had a mug of something hot in her hand, in the expression of someone who had been alone for a long time and had decided not to be strange about no longer being alone. "You found the boy data," she said. It wasn't a question. "What was here before you?" he asked. He was aware this was not a greeting, but found he didn't have the capacity for ceremony. She tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean before?" "The thermal readings. 14 months before your landing. Something started this." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, one of Marson's team." She came back, before the official record said anyone went missing. She looked at the conduit lines on the valley wall. She was here for 3 months, alone. She figured out the heartbeat, the timing cycle, left recordings, supply caches. Then she went back to get her team. "That's not in the Dominion file." "No," Vasquez said. "It's in ours." "Ours?" The weight of that word. He looked at the research station, at the conduit network, at the careful stone architecture that looked like it had been designed to be added to rather than completed. "How many are here now?" 43. 41 survey team members plus Vasquez plus one more. He filed the arithmetic away. "They don't want to leave?" he asked. She looked at him with the patience you extend to a question that has missed the point by exactly the width of a civilization. "They're not trapped," she said. "They came here to see if it could be done. It can be done. They stayed to do it." She took a drink from her mug. "There's a difference. He met some of them that morning, during the safe window, while the vents ran quiet and the valley held its strange, hard-won peace. They were from 7 different species. Dominion species, all of them. The second survey team had been mixed, multi-specialty, the kind of cross-disciplinary group assembled for exactly this type of designation. They were not haggard. They were not desperate. This was the word that kept surfacing in his notes, and that he kept suppressing as insufficiently scientific, purposeful. They had the quality of people who had found the thing they were supposed to be doing and were doing it. He spoke with a geologist named Fren who had been on the second survey team. Fren was from a species with 12-year average lifespans, which meant she had committed a significant fraction of her entire existence to this valley. "Weren't you afraid?" Krethbon asked. Fren considered the question with apparent genuine interest, as though it hadn't occurred to her. "In the beginning," she said, "the first thermal event after Vasquez left to get her ship's tools, that was terrifying. I'd miscalculated the timing and I was in the wrong section." She gestured at a scar on her left arm, old and clean. "But after that," she shrugged, "after that I understood it better. You learned from being nearly killed." "I learned from being surprised," she said. "I was nearly killed, yes, but the event taught me something I couldn't have learned from outside. You have to be inside the thing to know the thing." She looked at him directly. "Your teams kept leaving. Every time the planet hurt someone, your teams left. That's why you don't know it yet. You can't know a thing you're not willing to stay inside of." He did not answer immediately. He was thinking about the second word in category Omega-7, which was a designation meaning do not return, and about how that designation had been issued by an institution that had decided, based on the cost of entry, that Kasavra 4 was not worth understanding. He was thinking about how wrong that had been. The full weight of his misunderstanding arrived that afternoon, during the brief period between safe windows when the thermal cycle ticked upward and the residents of the valley retreated to their shielded stations with the easy habit of long practice. He had been reviewing Vasquez's engineering logs. She'd given him access without hesitation, which he now recognized as itself a kind of message, and he found the passage from day 31. The wall built on the wrong side. That's fine. I'll build another one. He sat with that. In Dominion's survey doctrine, a miscalculation of that scale on a hostile environment mission was grounds for mission abort and extraction review. Not because the error itself was insurmountable, but because an error suggested that the operator's environmental model was incomplete, and an incomplete model on a category Omega-7 surface was a mortality risk that could not be professionally justified. Vasquez had not aborted. She had built another wall. He kept reading. Day 44, conduit failure in the secondary diversion channel. 12 hours of repair work during available windows, including one repair session conducted during a partial thermal event because the timing was worse than projected. Got a bit warm, the log said. Held the line. Day 62, water recycler failure. Third failure. I've got a workaround. It's not elegant. I've had that thought before on this rock, and I'm starting to think elegance is something you pursue when you're not doing something genuinely hard. Functional is what matters. It's functional. Day 81, the first evidence that the valley floor temperature had dropped enough, long enough, to begin the next phase. She described it in the log with technical precision for 2 full minutes. Then she stopped. There was a silence in the recording. Then, I didn't think I'd make it to this part. Just that. Unguarded, tired, truthful. The voice of someone who had been afraid and had continued anyway and was now on the other side of something and knew it and was letting herself know it. Kreth Vaughn stopped the recording. He understood, finally, what he had been misreading this entire time. He had been analyzing Vasquez through the frame of capability, asking what she could do, what tools she had, what technical expertise enabled her survival. He had been asking the wrong question. The relevant variable was not what she could do. It was what she was willing to keep doing. The Dominion had assessed Kasavra IV and determined that the cost of engagement outweighed the probable return. This was rational, this was correct, by every analytical framework the Dominion used. The environment was too hostile, the losses too high, the benefit too uncertain. Vasquez had looked at the same calculation and felt angry about it. In that anger, not strategy, not superior technology, not evolutionary advantage, was the thing that had turned an Omega-7 world into a 43-person research settlement with a functioning water system and a thermal conduit network and morning light that came in gold. She found him sitting outside her station as the second safe window opened. She handed him a second mug of something hot without asking if he wanted it. He took it. "You're going to write a report," she said. "Yes." "It's going to recommend reclassification, probably, and the Dominion will send a formal team, with proper equipment, full environmental support." She looked across the valley. "They'll do in 6 months what we did in 2 years. He heard something in her voice, not resentment, something more precise. "You don't think that's a bad thing," he said. "Of course not." She looked at him. "That's why we did it. So it could be done faster, better, by more people." She paused. "I just want the record to show who was here first, not for credit, for accuracy, so that when the next Omega-7 comes up, and it will, the file says, humans attempted this before official assessment. They succeeded. Consider whether your assessment is the final word. You want to change how we classify impossible things. I want to change how you decide what counts as impossible. The thermal cycle ticked downward. Somewhere to the east, the second safe window was opening, and from this distance Kreth Van could hear, barely, beneath the geological background noise, the sound of people moving, working, doing the things that needed doing in the time available. He thought about the survivor who had described this valley at the end of her life, saying, almost breathable, almost warm, almost like somewhere you could stay. The almost was gone. Someone had been angry enough to close the distance. The official reclassification of Cassavor IV took 11 months. During that period, 4 additional humans joined the settlement. Volunteers, all certified, drawn by a report that had leaked through the same information network the Dominion monitored without fully understanding. By the time the formal survey team arrived with their full environmental systems and their professional optimism, the valley's thermal diversion network had been extended by another 60 meters, and a second structure had been raised on the valley's northern edge, built from the same volcanic stone, in the same layered addition style, with the same implicit assumption that more would come and more would need room. The formal survey team's lead specialist, a Dominion veteran with 30 years of hostile environment experience, reviewed the settlement's construction records and filed a technical assessment that Kreth Van was given access to as a courtesy given his involvement in the initial discovery. The assessment's final section read, "The engineering solutions employed demonstrate competence appropriate to certification level. What cannot be adequately assessed by engineering review alone is the operational decision-making framework that enabled sustained function under Category Omega-7 conditions. This framework appears to incorporate a risk tolerance threshold significantly in excess of any documented Dominion standard. Whether this is a species-level trait, a selection bias in the individuals present, or the result of a specific philosophical orientation toward hostile environment work is beyond the scope of this technical report. It is noted for the record because it is, in this specialist professional assessment, the only reason this settlement exists." Kreth Van read it 3 times. He thought about the 41 survey team members who had been listed as dead. Who had chosen to stay, who had sent no distress signal, not because they were incapacitated, but because they were not in distress. About friend Scar and her 11-word explanation. You have to be inside the thing to know the thing. About Vasquez's voice in the recording saying, "I didn't think I'd make it to this part. Tired and honest and alive." He filed his final personal assessment the same day. The last line of it, which his supervisor would later flag as insufficiently formal and which Kreth Van would decline to revise, read, "Cassavor IV was not made livable because humanity is more capable than the Dominion. It was made livable because humanity contains, apparently as a standard feature, the capacity to be furious at a planet and to act on that fury for years without stopping. Our classification system does not have a framework for what something costs when someone refuses to calculate the cost. We should develop one." The last time Kreth Van visited the valley was 3 years after the initial reclassification. The settlement had grown. He would not have recognized it from the orbital images alone. The thermal conduit network had expanded into something that resembled, from altitude, a circulatory system. Silver channels threading through the volcanic terrain like veins, diverting, cooling, managing the thing that had once been purely destructive and was now a source of geothermal energy for a settlement of 61. Vasquez was still there. He found her at the valley's northern edge, at the boundary of what had once been the most dangerous thermal zone, now marked by a line of small stones she'd placed herself. She was looking at a section of ground that still showed evidence of volcanic activity, raw, uneasy earth, sending up tendrils of vapor in the cool morning air. "Still expanding?" he asked. "Always," she said. "The northern basin is the next section, harder. The vent timing there is less regular, different rhythm." She looked at it with the expression he had come to recognize as her working face. Not fearless, not reckless, but oriented. It'll take longer. How much longer? She shrugged, just slightly. As long as it takes. He stood beside her and looked at the vapor rising from ground that should have been impassable, and thought about the word almost that had died here over 2 years of anger and work, and walls built on the wrong side and rebuilt on the wrong side and rebuilt on the right one, and about a species that looked at a planet designed to end them and had responded not with retreat, not with acceptance, but with the specific, patient, unrelenting fury of something that had decided the answer was no, actually, and had made it stick. The morning light came in gold. The vents ran quiet. Somewhere behind them, the settlement was waking up, and 61 people who had chosen to be inside the thing were already doing the work of the day. Kassavar IV was not the most dangerous planet humanity would encounter. Krethva knew that now. It was the one that happened to be first. The one that happened to have a valley almost worth fighting for, and one human who had read a dying woman's description of almost and had decided that almost was not a limit, it was an invitation. He would write that in the final version of his report, the one he kept for himself, the one that said what the official document couldn't quite hold. He would write, "I thought I was studying a survival case. I was studying a decision. The decision was not whether to survive. It was whether to accept that some things are permanently beyond reach. Humanity, as best I can determine, has not accepted this. They may never accept it. I do not think this is a flaw. I think it is the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, not because it destroys, but because it builds, in places where destruction was supposed to be the only possible outcome, and it does not stop building until the impossible thing is simply where someone lives." The light shifted. The vents exhaled. Vasquez picked up a stone from the boundary line, turned it in her hand, and set it back down in a slightly different position, pushing the line incrementally north.